Alright, hi guys. In honor of my opponent, Paul Morphy 62, in honor of Paul Morphy, who he's doing his tag in honor of. In honor of Paul Morphy, I'll be analyzing my latest game without computer analysis, because Paul Morphy was the greatest chess player before there was computers, and he was a little kid that was a genius and so far ahead of his time, it's unquantifiable. And because his opponents were so bad compared to him. But here we go with e4. But he did have a distinct style that um, that I kind of paid homage to in this game, more so than my opponent, even though he has the name. And Paul Morphy is like one of the greatest players of all time, the first unofficial world champion. So here we just have a basic. I go with the e pawn, which is classical, and that's what Morphy would play. And then knight f3. So far, I'm pretty Morphy-esque, and his opponent is pretty classical as well, or my opponent. So I guess we're both doing a good job. Now he played a good game, and he's a 2000 player. But wait till you see this game. This is definitely my greatest game ever as far as style points. Now I choose b3 here because I don't want to go into anything that he might know. So d4 or c3, preparing d4, or some people play knight takes, and then when the knight takes, pawn d4. I think that's called the Halloween gambit. That's crazy, but I do something even crazier than that. But first, I start slow with b3 because I want to see what he's going to do. And also, another option is developing my bishop. But my plan in this game was I'm going to get my pawn up so my bishop can get out and my knight out. So I'm threatening to develop the bishop and castle, but I'm also kind of sneakily planning queenside development first. And then I'm going to castle queenside potentially. So I kind of chose to keep my bishop as like a long-term option to like threat to come up to develop. But then I did something weird with it later, but that was why I went with b3. Then he goes immediately and says, why are you playing b3? Now I'm attacking your center, and you don't have time to play the bishop move because you're losing your pawn. And so here I could defend my pawn. The problem with defending this pawn is if I play the knight out to defend the pawn, then I haven't played my bishop out yet, and now my knight is a little bit weaker because this pawn doesn't support it. And also, if I do eventually play the bishop, well, my knight has blocked my bishop. When I do develop it, it won't be with any teeth. So instead, I decide to I don't want to dance with this guy's theory on either this square or this square. So here, I'm immediately playing like weird moves. After the first two standard moves, this move is a little strange, and then this move to defend this pawn is strange because I'm basically saying that I don't want to move this pawn because I've already moved this pawn, and this square, my dark square c3, is weak. If I just play a move like d 3 here, then I'm committing early on that all my pawns are on light squares, and that would mean that my dark square's bishop is indisposable, and also my light square bishop can never get into the game. So here, he's a target, but at least he's in the game. He's blocking my pawn, but my pawn is doing the job that my b pawn wasn't. So this is a 10-minute game. Maybe I'll show you the clocks later, but I didn't want to give away the moves on the screen. But this move, already very interesting game, and I'm defending my pawn. Practically speaking, it's not the worst move in the world. I develop my bishop, and I'm defending my pawn. Ideally, you want to get your d pawn up to d4, but he controls that and is attacking this. I have to address it, so that's what I do. Then he immediately plays his bishop out to a good square. Immediately, my head is pressure on f2. The knight can come to g. The knight can come to g4 and threaten knight f2 or bishop f2. knight f2 is better, and that would be a problem, so I have to maybe play a3 here. Also, he's ready to castle, so here I just ignore it and I develop my bishop because I decide if he plays the knight in, I have time for castle. So if knight g4 here, castle, and then if he tries to win the pawn with the bishop defending, rook takes, and then basically I win 2 minor pieces and I lose a pawn and a rook, and my king is safe, and that position is better for white. So he doesn't do that, and now his other bishop is threatening to come into the game. So his setup is extremely reasonable. There's no genius yet, but it is reasonable because he got his bishop out before he blocked it in, and now his bishop is controlling g4, so any knight move would no longer have a discovered attack on the knight on g4 that it's coming. Anyway, so I play h3 to prevent the knight and the bishop from... Normally I wouldn't play a move like h3 just to stop the knight, but if it stops 2 pieces from developing forward, then it's worth it. Also, I'm threatening to castle and have a flight square planned. Also threatening g4, but no way I'm thinking about that. This is a prophylactic defense only, just to secure my knight so it's not pinned by the bishop, and also to prevent his knight from coming in now that he's successfully like developed all his pieces. So he castles here, and so far nothing special. And here I think my knight's my worst piece, so I should get him into the game. I can think about playing pawn to c4 or c3. Ideally, in these positions, you want to play pawn to c3, bishop to c2. Protect the pawn still with your bishop, but also get your bishop out of the way of your d-pawn so that after c3, bishop c2, you can play d4. The pawn on e4 would be defended, and then this square on d4, there's a battle, but at least your queen can see it because the bishop's out of the way, and the pawn, even if you sacrifice it, at least then your knight can develop here or something without blocking your bishop. So that's the idea. But I didn't like what I saw there because of temporarily blocking my bishop, which is kind of the whole like strategy. Like it's my early structure is I'm using my bishop. But so I just decide to hop the knight out. And I'm blocking my bishop, but the idea here is I was actually thinking, I know I need to move this pawn and do that stuff, but first I'm going to get my knight into the game, and then my bishop is a little more flexible because it doesn't have to hang on this pawn, and also the knight here can attack. My idea was knight a4, attacking this bishop, and the bishop is blocked in, and if it goes back, I can take it, and then I'll have a bishop pair, and if it goes forward, I can castle and take it, or I can just take it with the king, or I can, it actually, if it goes here, the knight controls that, and this pawn controls this, so the bishop is basically dead if I want to play knight a4, so that's kind of the idea, and then also that would free up the c pawn. But, so he develops his rook, nothing special, and then in this position, I started just to like my position and how it looked, how I fianchettoed here and had a bishop here. It's like weird, but it works. And so I decided to just play queen e2 because I don't really feel like moving my knight to the rim and doing that exchange idea. I'm just going to develop my queen and threaten to castle queenside, and I felt like I had enough pieces here and this setup here, my king would be safe castling queenside here. And then I could launch forward with g4, g5. And then like rook, you know, over there. But here he immediately plays a really smart move. Gosh, I would never play that move. I know I was thinking maybe knight in attacking queen, but then I could just take, and then when he takes, I can like hop around, no big deal, no huge threat. Also here, I'm walking in front of my his last move is rook in front of my king if these center pawns are out of the way. And by putting my queen here, I'm basically tactically vulnerable, and this is not a good move or strategy. But I just liked what I go. Sometimes I just have intuition of a feeling, and this is a before computers, so we're not even gonna let it call me stupid. All right. So, because he has to deal with this, so he's just a person. We're not using computers during the game. So, how does he punish this move? He immediately plays a really good move. Now, the problem is if I take and he pushes, he starts to open up this file, and I'm losing 5 points there. So, even if I win something, I'm still losing. So, this is a dangerous position for me. And but I'm thinking offensively here. And this pawn is annoying to defend, and this bishop doesn't want to guard it. It would, like, I'm getting the opportunity to take. So I just take because long term, I know that this bishop, by taking without losing material, I'm actually gaining a pawn with an attack on the knight. This bishop now attacks h7 and has long-term prospects. Also, the queen can play up to e4 and then checkmate on h7 in some cases. So I basically just opened up this diagonal in the position without losing a pawn. Now, he immediately, after deflecting my pawn away, his plan was to only then hop in, because if he hops in right here, when I take it, and he takes back with an attack on my knight, I have time to move my knight because the rook is not fully activated against my queen and king. But by pushing this pawn first and threatening to play it again and then blocking my bishop for the rest of the game, or like take or something, by sacrificing that pawn and then playing his knight in, now I can't take because then he would play pawn takes and the rook would hit the queen with the king and I would lose the game. So I can't, normally when you're under attack, your queen is under attack and you have a chance to eliminate it, you do, but not here. So I play, I'm also thinking bishop sacrifice here, deflecting his knight and then playing queen up here. Attacking his knight and threatening checkmate. But then in those variations, it just never worked. Also, his bishop can develop here, and his knight defends that. I don't honestly remember what I played here. Maybe I just... Oh, okay, this is where I thought for like 10 minutes. It's a 10-minute game. We each have 10 minutes. This is where I thought for like 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes, like a ridiculous amount of time. Because he's basically... If we look at the whole game from his perspective, he's getting everything he wants, and then he sees a tactical vulnerability, so he plays another pawn move, and then he comes in smartly where I can't take, but then I just say, fuck you, basically. And I'm basically saying I don't care because of the fact that all my pieces are going to play in this game and his rook over here is not going to. I know I'm castling queenside and this rook's going to play a role and his rook is not in time. And so I can do this, and we're not going to let the computer prove me wrong. I can do this move. It is a blunder, but I thought it through and I played this because queen... My other options, if I take, I lose my queen because of pawn takes. The queen is hit. If I play queen e4, I lose it to the knight. If I play queen e3, that's what I played in the game, so we'll talk about that later. If I play queen d1, I'm going back to where I've started, and I'm basically admitting that I fucked up. And I didn't feel like doing that in this game because I liked what I saw. So, but I could play queen d1 here, get out of this, but then he still can push forward, and it's a problem with my king. And if I play queen f1, Um, Basically same problem. This pawn push is always really strong, and my queen would be kind of out of the game, and I don't really have time to castle and all this stuff. So instead, I just step right up. If he takes my knight with check, trying to attack me with his bishop, queen can just take the knight. And I have the problem with the push is so strong that queen d1 and queen f1 both lose to the push because the push is strong enough to kill one of my minors and break through the position. But if I keep my queen in the game temporarily in the fight, he never has this push anymore. And if he takes the knight, I get out of the pin. And if he goes here with check, which he does, um, I'm losing my queen because my king is under attack, and no matter where my king goes, my queen is hit, and I can't kill the knight with my queen. And if I kill the knight, which I do, he kills my queen. So game over, right? Like resign, right? So he tricked me, and I should resign here, right? But watch this. I can kill the bishop now because he killed his dark square bishop killed my queen, which means my dark square bishop is now a strong piece. And it's just squares on a board. And this rook is not controlling any of them. And watch what happens. Okay, so I'm going to play capture the bishop, but I'm taking with the d pawn because now my pawn structure is perfect, basically. Um, because I had double pawns before, but now, oh shit. I'm sorry. So I take back. Okay. Now it's his turn and he's up a queen, basically. Like, what's the count after I take and it's his turn? It's his turn. He has rooks, a queen, a bishop, and a knight. I have rooks, so those cancel out. I have a light square bishop, so those cancel out. I have a knight, so those cancel out. So he has a queen that I don't have. And then what do I have that he doesn't have? I have a light squared bishop and an extra knight. So it's basically 2 minors for a queen game. And my pawn is under attack. He could have just won it immediately. But the problem is he can't because, and I calculated this. If he in this position takes the pawn with the queen, I have knight takes the queen, and then that doesn't work. If he, but the whole idea is he has 2 attackers on this pawn, and I only have 1 defender, so shouldn't he be able to win it? Well, if he takes it with the knight, then I have castles queenside, which puts the rook on d1, the king on c1, and then with the rook on d1 and the knight on d5, it's pinned to the queen. So I would be winning a 3rd minor piece, and then it'd be 3 minors for the queen. And my bishops are excellently placed, and that would be enough to win, I think, with the rook on the center file as well. So here in this position, he attacks my knight, and okay, so I could play rook. This is a really interesting move because normally I would play knight d4, but then that would get in the way of my rook from pinning his knight. So it would actually drop the pawn on d5 if I played knight d4 because I don't have time for castles with all my tricks. So I decide to play knight g5 because I'm also kind of desperate at this point. I did drop a queen, and I know I am technically losing. But I'm having fun, and I'm trying to beat him, and I'm under attack. And if I retreat, like I don't have enough. When you're down a queen, you can't you can't reduce into an endgame where you're up 2 pawns or down 2 pawns and he has a queen, because the queen will be too powerful. Even if you have 3 minor pieces or something, he'll just win them all. So you have to strike fast before the queen can be good, and use all your pieces together against the king as well. Use the king as a thing. And normally, also, one thing I want to say is when I play these games, when you sacrifice your queen, you will, generally speaking, if you planned it, meaning like you saw at least a move ahead that your queen was in trouble and you planned a sacrifice, um, like you had your reasons, in those positions, you will, generally speaking, win some material back. The question is, do you win enough back to justify your queen sacrifice? And so here I play knight g5 because I have to be active. Now there's pressure on h6. If he retreats the knight for no reason, then suddenly I can crash through and get him on that square, win some pawns, and start checking him and activate my bishops. Also, this knight maneuver here is a common evasion of this pawn push, and then these two knights now work together on this. He's defending it twice, I'm attacking it 3 times now. So what's he going to do? He also can't win this pawn because of my castle. But he goes for it because now he can. The difference is I don't have time for the tricks anymore because my knight is hanging, because this is a discovered attack on my knight. So instead of winning the pawn right away, he deflected my knight, and no matter where it went, he used that as a tactical reason to then go through with the center pawn attack. So in this position, my knight is under attack from the queen, and his knight is vulnerable because I always have this idea of castling. The problem is if I castle here and he wins the knight just outright, in that position, I can win the knight with an attack on his queen. Like if I play castle here and he takes my knight, then I could play rook takes knight and attack his queen, but that's not good enough because he would play rook takes pawn, attack my rook, and just kind of, or he wouldn't even take that pawn. He could just back up and claim he's better because he is. But instead of all that, I play, and I could also say that this knight is vulnerable and needs to retreat back and join in the fun because whatever. But I choose to take with this knight because it gets out of the exchange. So now his knight doesn't have, his knight is a tactical vulnerability on this file with the queen, but now it doesn't have the ability to take and get out of its own way. And also, it can't advance anymore, really. And my knight in this position is attacked by the rook, but controlled by my bishop. I just activated my light square bishop by moving this knight. I'm winning a pawn, and I'm defending my other knight, which is under attack by the knight. So although he wins a pawn, I win his pawn and activate both my bishops. And now his knight is deflected, so, and if he retreats back, it doesn't really work because I have a lot of pressure with the bishop and the knight there, and his queen doesn't want to recapture. And then when the pawn recaptures, his king is open. So here, my knight is under attack by the rook, and if he looks at his position, he looks at this knight here and says, you can't stay there forever. Right now, my queen can't take you because your knight is here. He could play knight, rook takes knight here, and then if I play bishop takes knight, he could play queen takes knight, but he didn't do that. Instead, he developed his bishop, trying to get his other rook into the game before it's over. And I still haven't even castled yet, but I had to do this maneuver. Now he's attacking my knight twice, and I'm defending it twice. The problem is exchanges are good for him because I'm down material, and also he can kick my knight, and then if I retreat it, then I only have one defender here, and he would After attacking my knight, if I move back, he can win the knight, and then when I take back, he wins it again. So what do I do here? Well, I have to castle. So I castle with an attack on his knight and his queen, and I get my king to safety defending both bishops. And now, um, this is like a crazy game, isn't it? So okay, so he goes, what did he do? Let's see what he did. Okay, so he tries to kick my knight, and then in this position, if I play knight f3 and just go back like a normal person, he would play bishop takes e4, like I said, and the rook and the bishop win my knight. So I cannot move this knight, even though it's under attack. If I play knight takes f7 desperately, trying to lure the king out, attacking the queen, he could just take it with the king, and then I have no queen to attack it. I have no immediate way to win anything. I can't believe this is just such a brilliant move. I just remembered what I. This is definitely the smartest move I've ever played. If it's the one I'm thinking of, you'll never ever in a million years. It's because of a book I'm reading um, called Game Changer by Matthew Sadler and Natasha Reagan about Google AI and chess. And in this position, okay, so I don't play it yet. So hold on. So first I play g4 because I'm desperate now, right? Because he's attacking my knight and I can't move it. So I counterattack his bishop, saying, if you take my knight, I will take your bishop. So he is only trying to win the knight so that he can win the center. But if he wins the knight and then I win his bishop, I hold on to the center and he can no longer take my knight because his bishop's dead. So in this position, if he retreats all the way back, I can bail out and take his bishop with my knight and then hop out of here or something. But he goes to the perfect little tuck away square where my knight can't attack it. It's safe here and it's out of the attack of the pawn, still applying the same amount of pressure on my knight. And now my knight is still under attack, and if I move it to knight f3, he can take the knight with impunity. So what do I do? And if I sacrifice on f7, it really doesn't work because bishop can take. So what do I do? Well, you could play f4 and then try to play f5, but even then it's too slow and it's ineffective because of bishop h7. And also he's taking this knight next move. So how do I compensate for that? Well, I do have some action on the queen with this rook and this knight. So I also have a check on f6. If I play knight f6 right here, that would be check and rook. The king, if it moves, I could take the rook and get out of my problems. However, if he takes me with the queen or the knight or the pawn, I don't feel like calculating it all. I'm just trying to explain to you. It's a crazy looking move, but I'm calculating it. And he wouldn't take with the knight because rook would take the queen. But if he took with the queen, I would take with the bishop. The bishop controls this square, and so does the knight. So even though the pawn, the queen, and the knight control it, I'm still considering it. And because I force awkward things for him because the knight actually can't move, and neither can the queen. Because if I check the king, he's in check, so he has to react. And if he moves, like I said, that's not good for him. So if he takes me with the pawn, then my knight is under attack twice, and if I take with the bishop, he can just take with the queen or the knight. Well, no, he can't. So in a lot of positions, his knight has trouble hopping back because of the queen getting lost, and his queen can't recapture because of the two pieces. So knight check here. If pawn takes, I've lost a knight. My other knight is still under attack, and I have no good move really. If I took with the bishop, attacking the queen, he could take with the queen, and then when I take, I could win his knight, but I would have lost 2 minors and won 1 minor, so it wouldn't be worth it. But I play the absolutely brilliant. I mean, we're not going to let the computer ruin all the fun and be like, well, you should have played a different move. So here, I play the bishop first, immediately attacking the queen and asking it what it's going to do, and reserving my knights, because ultimately my goal is, if I play the knight check, yes, it's a check, but he does kill it, and the bishop isn't good enough at checking the king on a light square for it to do the knockout punch that I need. So instead, I play the ingenious bishop to f6 in front of a pawn and a knight and a queen, just saying, what's up? And he takes it. I forget how long he thought about it. I played this, obviously I thought for a little bit, but faster than most people would, or no one would ever play this move. But this is the type of move that Google would play. The Alpha Zero. So anyway, so I play here. He takes. And look, I don't think I'm that, like, I'm not like that full of myself. It's literally just, I admire it. I like, that's the book I'm reading. I like AI playing chess better than people and learning how it plays. And it would play a move like this because it understands that sometimes the best thing to do is move a bishop right in front of a pawn and just ask to be taken. Because if you are taken, now your knights can take advantage of the structure. If your bishop wasn't going to be used in your attack, this can help. So now, it's so funny because, okay, if he takes with the queen, I win because I take his queen. If he takes with the pawn, or if he takes with the knight, I take his queen and I win. If he takes with the pawn, which he does, then he is vulnerable to the brilliant follow-up shot. So, boom, and then boom. Rook takes knight. Attacking the queen again. So I attack the queen, he takes me, I attack the queen again. And the queen can take the rook. But if he does, my knight checks the king and wins the queen. And for some reason, like, he's playing really well, like better than me. He's straight up, people are better than me at this level. I have to play out of my mind to advance in this level. So, like, he's good. He's winning. I blunder a queen. But just because of chess, because of the beauty of chess, I take back and I attack his king and I get both my knights in tandem and I start to pin his knight and I sacrifice, I counterattack, and then I play a fucking brilliant move, because you can't play slowly here. If I play slowly, I lose my knight and then I lose my other knight and then the game's over because I don't have a queen. But by playing this brilliant move, then I can, in this position, I take the knight, and then he can't take back because the game's over. And if he like, what is his best move? I'm not gonna let the computer tell me. I'm just gonna now think about it. I know it's not taking. Um, Also in this position, maybe not. Maybe, rook blocks or something crazy. Like I don't even know about that. But in this position, if the queen moves to the side to c8, what is the count? Well, then I could play knight check and win the rook. But he still is going to come out on top with the queen in a lot of games. Um, I have to win his queen with tactics, and so he shouldn't. And then maybe he saw it, maybe he didn't. But another move to consider is, I mean, it's a beautiful move. The reason it's so good is because he has to react because it's an attack on the queen. Sometimes you leave a rook hanging for a queen, knowing that you have a knight fork, but he doesn't take the bait. But here he has to, otherwise I'm killing him. And if he steps to the side, I'm still getting him. And if he stays here, so if he plays Queen E7, I think I'm lost in that position. So I think Queen E7 here. So, because I play my ludicrous move, and then I play the really strong follow-up. Because obviously I played my ludicrous move for... It's funny because I want you to understand, if I didn't play this and have this knight would never have a chance to check. Because if I just take the knight with the rook here and the queen takes, and then I try to fork the queen in the rook, or the queen in the king, he takes me with his pawn. So that's why this bishop move is so smart, is because now the pawn has to no longer defend where it is. It's vulnerable there. And then I take the knight, and then I check. Oh, but Queen E7 here, I still have my rook, and I can play rook D4 hanging on to my knight. But then I lose this knight. So he would play Queen E7, and then this knight would be hanging, and this piece would also be hanging. So I would have the same problem. And then I would have to think of something like maybe rook D1 or H4, and then when he takes the knight, take back with the H pawn and have my rook on the H file. But I always have this threat, and anyway, he couldn't handle it. Like, you know what I mean? A computer can handle it, but a person, if you play bishop D3 against a real person, they're gonna try to play normally, and then you play this move, and then they're gonna be like, okay, well, you're stupid, and then you just you just step into danger, because I don't want to allow his rook to be good, so I just step into danger, allow the bishop to kill me, and then I have this beautiful position where even though I'm down a queen, and basically down a piece, my bishops are good. And then I have this attack going on, and then I play this, and then there's check. Okay, sorry. Okay, so it gets even more interesting. So here it's check. And the idea is the king is under attack and has to move. And wherever it goes, I can win the queen. But he chose here. And in this position, if I take the queen, then he has bishop takes bishop, and I can't take the bishop back, and I also can't play the knight forking the rooks, because his rook will team up against my king with the bishop and I'll lose my knight. So I'm like thinking about that, but my rook is hanging, and also if I take the rook, it's with check, whereas if I take the queen, it's not with check. So that's why I was thinking about it. Um, but it's just not it's not good. So then I went for the queen, obviously. But it is worth considering sometimes when it comes with a check. Like if I could get the rook for free and then force his king back and then check him again and then get the queen, that'd be good. But anyway, I get the queen. And then also I'm thinking here because the reason why check is appealing here is because then I save this knight. So just so you understand, if knight takes rook with check, then he has to move his king. I thought, I guess I wasn't calculating rook takes because that kills my knight. But if the king were to move, then I would have the opportunity to hop a knight or something. But anyway, it does none of it works. So I kill the queen, and then he takes my knight. So in this position, because I've sacrificed a queen, and then I've sacrificed a full bishop, even after, well, basically, then I sacrifice a rook. That's another sacrifice. So look at the trades I'm doing. It's queen. First, he does knight for pawn, so I'm up 2. Then he wins the queen, and I win the bishop, so I get +6 or -6 there, and I was up 2, so I'm -4 now. And then I play here, and now I'm -5, and then I'm -4 again, and then here I castle. Now my knight, I'm -4, and my knight is under attack, so it's -4, maybe -7 if I don't move the knight. And then I attack his bishop, -4 still. Now here it's almost -7 again because there's no way to save this knight or end this knight at the same time. So it's about -7 here. And then I play the bishop sacrifice, which is another piece. So it's 9 points of material that I'm offering for nothing. And no material of his, just tactical positioning. So here, he takes, I take, oh, and then, okay, so I'm not even done. So after the 9 is a rook for knight is -3 for me. So I'm -12 basically here. So I go down 12 points of material in this position. I'm down 12 points of material, but it says +8, but that's because there's pawns involved. I don't know, whatever. Well, also my knight's hanging, and I'm counting that. But here I take, get a pawn back, and then a queen back. Interesting how it's keeping score right there. I didn't even notice. But in this position, after I win the queen, he takes my knight. And so now it's rook, knight, and bishop versus rook, rook, and bishop. So it's basically rook versus knight. But I also have more pawns than him. I have one more pawn. So it's a knight and a pawn versus a rook. And it's my turn. And my knight and a pawn are not as good as a rook. So I cannot just take the bishop and try to win. I mean, the computer would have something to say here about it, but I am kind of ecstatic that I won the queen. I also spent a lot of my brain power on this game and have very little time, and I was the one calculating all the crazy sacrifices, so he's the one with more time on the clock here, because obviously he just takes my bishop, you know, when I put it there, and I am the one who has to calculate it. So here I just decide to win one of the rooks because I know that he can play one of the rooks over to attack my knight, and then if I take his other rook, it's with check, so that doesn't work. But if he moves this rook and I take that rook, then he can take my bishop with check. But that's what he does. I was kind of hoping for bishop takes bishop, and then his bishop would get in his own way of the pin, and I would win one of the rooks with check. But anyway, he gets out of it. Best move probably. And then I just decide here, if I take his rook or his knight or his bishop, if I take his bishop, then my bishop's gonna die, and my knight's gonna die also. And my knight didn't win anything after the queen. All it did was win a pawn. So this is bad for me if the rook can just win it after I only win a pawn, because I never should have won this pawn if that's all I'm gonna do. So that's why I go in for the rook, allowing this, and he checks me, because if he takes with the bishop, he doesn't really, I mean, that's kind of interesting, but he checks me, obviously. That's what comes to mind. Now he's also threatening both of my pawns. Whichever way I move, he can kill a pawn. I go this way, and he decides, after winning, he's also thinking about my knight, which is going to have a hard time escaping while his rook controls this file. That's another reason why not to take with the bishop, is because then the rook would be tied to the bishop, and it wouldn't be able to go win the knight without the king killing the bishop. So he checks me, and then he goes back to try to win the knight. And the knight cannot escape because the rook would take it. And if he goes out here, the pawn would take it. Now here, one of the best moves is knight to b6, because it attacks the rook. And if the pawn takes, your knight was going to die anyways. And at least he did a job of making these pawns doubled and not able to support each other, and easier for the rook in the endgame to hunt down. So that would be called a desperado, but instead I play, I thought for like a long time here, and I played f4, because if he takes the knight now, I would play f5, which would shut out this bishop and just kind of like claim an advantage, with then maybe pushing my e-pawn to victory somehow and shutting out his bishop. Because once he wins my knight, it's going to be rook and bishop versus rook. And if I can shut out his bishop and have a pawn advantage, that's my only chance. Otherwise, he'll have an extra piece and win. So I have to strike now. He takes, instead of taking my knight, he takes the pawn first because he doesn't want his bishop to be shut out. And then here I take, I'm also just trying to confuse him with the order. So we're both being very fancy. So here I decide to throw in the move now, while suddenly there's tension, because now that there's tension with pawns and I'm doing this, it's kind of confusing, because now if he takes the pawn, he has to calculate, can I take this pawn? And he can't, because then I would take his rook. So he takes my knight, but that damaged the structure. My knight was going to die anyways, and then now I win the pawn back. And I did this kind of wrong, because I think the best move here is taking with the pawn, and then if he takes my knight, then I have f5. The thing is, if I did take with the pawn, he would throw in bishop c to check, and then if I played king d2, keeping an eye on the bishop, preventing him from taking the knight, he could retreat the bishop to e4 and attack my rook and kind of have this diagonal. So I just decided to damage this and then take, and then he decides, this is probably where he first went wrong. He's panicking because he sees that I'm going to play f5, and I have damaged his structure on the left, So after I play f5 and his bishop is blocked in, I can move my rook and king and use them to, the rook will come down and win these pawns, and the I'll win the game over here, and his bishop won't be able to help in time. So he panics and well, he's attacking my pawn, and he thinks that it is a really good move, but in my opinion, it's still the wrong idea, because now if I try to save my pawn and I play like a normal move, like pawn a3, so the bishop can't get it, then he would have bishop checks and wins this pawn on b2 because my b3 because my a2 pawn defends b3. So by attacking a2, if I move it, he wins the other one. I could defend it with the rook, but instead I play rook to e1. So instead of developing the rook this way, I develop it this way because I want it to be able to go to e5 and prevent the king from entering the game, and also be supported by f4 and prevent the advance of his pawn. And kind of that was my idea, is I can get out, and then I also have checks against the king and prevent stuff. And it's just kind of good on the e file, because on the h file it's limited because of this pawn in the way. So here he just takes the pawn and threatens to take my other pawn with check, and then he would be up a piece. And how am I going to win this game, right? Also, I'm like running out of time here. He has like 3 minutes and I have like 30 seconds or something. I'll show you the clock after. So here I play. This is, now you'll see why I'm saying this is bad for him. After he takes this pawn, I play rook e. I saw here in this position that if I let him take this pawn, I have to play rook e3. And now with rook e3, the bishop cannot kill my pawn. And because of the way his pawns are blocking his rook and not able to attack my pawn, his rook is his only chance to get his bishop out. And his rook has no ability because it's less active than my rook, and my king prevents it from entering on these two squares. My rook prevents it from entering on this square. My pawn prevents it from entering on my 50-yard line. So his rook can only be on his side of the board right now, and my rook defends my only weakness and my other weakness, and so my two weaknesses, sorry. And then, but it's a strength because he has to sacrifice his bishop for my rook, and then my rook will win his pawns, and then I'll be winning by 2 pawns over here. So he could try to get his bishop out by playing, right now he could panic and play bishop b1, trying to retreat the bishop. The problem is I can always play f5 and not allow the bishop from escaping, because the pawn would take it on f5, and it can't use e4 or d3 or c2 because the rook and the king prevent all those. So you'll notice how the rook cannot come in the whatever. And this is because of my compensation. So although I'm like down a bunch of shit, by him spending time winning material, winning my knights, I'm getting something done with f4, which is that after these exchanges and he's trying to win more material, and then he does win the material, he's left with a lost position where although he has an extra piece, it's trapped. And my pawn structure is unassailable. And so he checks me, but that just lets me get closer to his bishop, and my king can go win his bishop, and his bishop cannot use that b1 square, especially now because the king. Before it was because of f5, and he couldn't play f5 himself because then I would play g5, and the bishop would not be able to get out. His own pawn would be in his way. But maybe it could outpost on the e file. I don't know. Maybe he just didn't want to sacrifice it because then I would have a passed pawn. Uh, I would just have. I don't know. It's interesting. But anyway, he goes here, attacks my pawn, and in this position, I can play king to b2 and attack the bishop, and the bishop is dead. But he could win the pawn on f4, and even if I win the bishop, if he activates his rook and starts winning pawns, it might be a draw. So also he has check on d2, saving the bishop. So if I played king b2, he can play rook d2 check, and I can't win the bishop. And if I get out of check, he can, he just has an improved rook position there. And then so here, um, so this is a really good move. I play f5, and this is a great move because the rook is no longer attacking that pawn, and all my pawns are defended. They're defended by each other, and the stationary point of defense that defends the next point, which defends the next point, is defended by my rook horizontally, and he can't get in behind it to attack it from behind. And the king can't get in. It's just bad for him to. It's really strong, this position for white, and so here he tries to do something, but again, there's no entrance. There's nothing he can do. The bishop is dead, and he's trying to pull some strings, but here I just attack the bishop, and it's going to die. He tries to save it by checking me, but then I go here. I could go to a3, but I actually liked a1. I'm also frantically low on time at this point, and a3, king a3 allows bishop b1. So the king prefers a1 because it keeps an eye on both squares of the bishop, and I'm going to kill the bishop wherever it goes. And if the bishop tries to kill my pawn, I have rook takes bishop, attacking his rooks, and I'm always still defending my pawn, which he can't attack twice because the bishop can never get out. And he tries to bring his king into the game here. If he does get his king really close, like on a3, then he could play checkmate because I can't kill the bishop because the king would protect it. But the king cannot get through because the placement of my rook is so perfect that there's no progress that he can make. It's just like a puzzle that can't be solved, and he's slowly realizing it. And then so here he plays this move because again there's no moves. There's nothing. He's played with his rook to the best of his ability, and if he checks me, I win his bishop. So he accomplishes nothing. And if he moves the rook, I win his bishop. If he tries to get behind my pawns and win them, I win his bishop. So he can't actually do anything. And now my rook still has to prevent his bishop from taking the pawn, but my rook does not have to defend pawns from his rook because his rook is paralyzed to defending his bishop. So this position, although it looks like he's attacking, it's actually me who's attacking his bishop, and his bishop cannot escape. He's trying to save it. He can't check me or I win his bishop, and he can't undermine my pawns, so I can just use my rook vertically with freedom, and I can like with the guns so the king can't cross, and then I can also check him with pawns as much as I want and move my pawns up as much as I want because his rook cannot stop the pawn without dropping the bishop. So here I play 5 eventually. But here in this position, I play rook to d um, 3, and I'm low on time here, and I just needed to make a move, and also I'm allowing the king to enter. I didn't want to make this move, but I actually didn't have uh, other good moves identified yet, such as h5. If I play g5 check, it drops the pawn. The king would just win the pawn on f5 and get into the game. So I actually can't play my g pawn. Uh, if I play h5, I allow the king in. So first, so I have to move the rook. But if I move the rook away, the bishop will get out. So I have to stay on this file. And I decide rook d3. And now his king is allowed into the game. But by his king being over here, now I can play. Now he's abandoning. Look where his king was, and now look where his king is. My h pawn is gonna go queen because his king is out of position, and his rook can't stop it without losing the bishop, and then I'll be in a winning endgame. So I play h5 here. And if his king was still here, it could play king g5, but he's too slow now. So he tries to attack my rook, but this doesn't work at all because now my rook, again, does not care about going up here and winning pawns. These pawns aren't preventing my queening. They're useless. So it would waste time to go win them. It's purposeless. This is my asset, h5. So my rook is under attack, and I can move it over to h3, get out of the attack, still prevent the king from getting into the game, and running away from the king a decent amount of space so it can't immediately attack it again. Also, now the rook cannot, like, in this position, he should be playing his rook to h2, getting behind my pawn. It's protected, so I wouldn't play it again, but it at least stops me from queening. But here he tries to attack my rook, which backfires because now the rook, his rook cannot, it really can't stop my pawn because rook takes rook if he plays rook h2. So now he brings his king, and he's trying to win this pawn with an attack on my rook. And then when he wins my rook, he can win the pawn by stopping it with the rook or the bishop. But instead, in this position, with my pawn under attack, instead of defending it with the rook on h4, which is a terrible move, because then the king would just attack it again, I play the fantastic h6, allowing king g5 attacking the rook, because in that position I was going to play h7. And then when he took the rook, I was going to play h8 queen with check. And then when he moves the king, I was calculating I have a queen here, and he has a rook and a bishop, and he's in check, and it's my turn. So can I immediately win material? And I was calculating that, but instead he played this. And he's also playing fast because he's trying to beat me on time, because I literally won this game with like 1 second left. And maybe it was more comfortable than that, like 10 seconds. But here, I'm prepared, fully prepared. See, I'm not actually, that's not the best variation for me, sacrificing my rook, because I can always play rook h1 and then queen, you know. But I was just calculating, can I always, you got to calculate the pawn push. Is h7 better than even defending my rook? And so because I'm calculating that, when he takes the pawn, this is where it gets really smart. Like, seriously. When he takes the pawn here, he's offering it for the rook. If the rook swings over and wins the bishop for free, black is not losing anymore, because then he can play rook h2 and win my pawn on h6, because if I try to defend it, the king can take the pawns, and he might even win that game because he has an active king and my king's in the corner. But instead of taking the bait, I just play h7 anyways. And his bishop, although liberated, is not in time and not on the right color to stop my queen. And in this position, he attacks my rook, but now I can queen and defend it at the same time. In the other variation, I was sacrificing the rook and queening with check, but here he took too long because he tried to cheat with the bishop getting out, but I didn't fall for it. And then in this position, I literally have like almost no time, and I'm calculating what is my next move with my queen now that I've queened and defended my rook. Uh, he doesn't have like good checks because I would just run up the board and attack his bishop, and he's clumsy. And also my next move is rook takes bishop. But I'm thinking instead of rook takes bishop, I'm basically reevaluating the position, because first I was just trying to make a queen. Once I got the queen, now I'm like, okay, his bishop's hanging, and if he defends it, then I have checkmate, which is rook h, queen h5 and queen h4 are potential checkmates depending on what he does, and then he wins the pawn with the rook, which immediately is checkmate because it blocks the king from escaping, and now the queen and the rook defend each other and attack the king, and the king has no escape because his own rook's in his way. So that's the most ridiculous game I've ever played. To me, it's just beautiful to watch when it works. So this is the position after the queen sacrifice. How do you win the game? You sacrifice more and more, and then you get it back, and then you sacrifice more, and then you get it back, and then you sacrifice more, and you get this pawn structure where he only has 3 pawns, and one of them is isolated on the king side versus 3 pawns. In other words, he has no chance. And then on the other side, they're doubled up against 2 pawns, and so it's again advantage white. His only advantage is his bishop, and my rook just defends my pawn in time and defends my other pawn, which defends my other pawn. And with this structure here, there's just no weakness, and the king gets involved, but then somehow by the king getting involved, and me playing h5, I mean, even technically, I think as soon as I play h4, like right here, my best move might be rook h3 to prevent rook h2 and just march the pawn down. But then if I telegraph that right now, he would play the king back and try to block it. But by kind of like going left and baiting the king up and then going, now he's too late. And it's checkmate. All right. Well, Hope you enjoyed that, Paul Morphy. Shout out to you. And I'm not going to do the computer ever on this game because it will just spoil the fun. Last time. It's just such a classy game. Like, I've dreamt of playing games like this, like when I was learning how to play chess. And it's just so crazy that I learned how to do it. But yeah, thanks for watching.